Good evening. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Olga Otomanova, and I want to greet you in Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum. Today, it's almost 9 years of the war, and today is day 358 of the full-scale aggression of Russian invaders in our homeland. And today we will be speaking about the utmostly important topic. We will be presenting the new project for the strategy, the state strategy for the internally displaced persons until year 2025. And I want to introduce our speakers today. It's Iryna Vereshchuk, Vice Prime Minister, Minister for the Reintegration of Temporarily Occupied Territories of Ukraine. Right by my side is Hanna Hristova, Council of Europe Office in Ukraine, Alena Lunyova, Zmina Human Rights Center, Maria Krasnenko, Public Holding Group of Influence, and Valeria Vereshchuk, Charity Foundation Stabilization Support Services in Ukraine. Thank you for joining us today. So, Ms. Iryna, this important subject, can you please describe the framework of this strategy that we will be discussing right now? Thank you, dear colleagues. Good evening, everybody. I want to start with the words of gratitude because there was a great job done by everybody that consumed a lot of efforts. There were a lot of emotions because this type of documents and documents of such scale are born only with the count of the experience and including negative experience, because as you mentioned, it's been almost 9 years of the war, and we had internally displaced persons from year 2014. The situation changed now. We had a strategy previously, and we used to present it right here. Thank you, dear colleagues, you who participated in development of that previous strategy, and now it looks as the new strategy, actualized strategy, so that our internally displaced persons, we had to evaluate all the experience, since the moment when the person decides to leave their home and until the very last phase when we have to either support them in integrating to the territorial communities or reintegrate, get back to that place where a person left previously. So it's a very responsible work on part of the state, of the government, and on the international partners. I want to thank Hanna Hristova and the work of the European Council in Ukraine, our civil sector, Alena, Miss Maria, Miss Valeria. Everybody worked a lot. All the personnel of Ministry of Reintegration, the colleagues worked a lot. We knew that there would be a dialogue, maybe even a discussion. We sent a presentation draft to all the involved bodies and agencies of the executive authority, and our goal is to get the feedback, to stimulate the dialogue. Maybe we want to improve something, because shortly during the session of the Cabinet of Ministers, this draft strategy will be approved, including the implementation plan, because until year 2025 we will live in compliance with this project, with this draft. So I want to pass the mic to my colleagues to go step by step. We have 5 goals, and we could discuss them in more detail and ask all and answer all the questions that we are about to be asked. The participation of the international partners is always important in creation of such documents. So your experience, your evaluation of this document. Thank you. Thank you, dear Ms. Iryna, dear colleagues, partners. For the Council of Europe, it's utmostly important to do everything we can within our mandate to support Ukraine in these dark and these difficult times. The Council of Europe made its stance on in a categorical and unambiguous manner. Russian Federation is the aggressor state, and they're not part of the Council of Europe. Russian Federation does not comply and is not a part of the European Convention. It means that millions of people, in fact, were deprived by this aggressor state of that protection that Council of Europe provides, and European Convention and European Mechanism on Protection of Rights provides, and Council of Europe does everything they can to bring the aggressor state to liability, to not only political but to legal liability, and helps Ukraine with all means on its way in compliance with the European standards, even during the war. And it's a very noble position of the state that is in war, that faces the most difficult challenges after the World War II to comply with the standards for human rights. And one of the ideas tracked in the document is attempt by all means possible to comply with the basic standard on the human rights for internally displaced persons, and we appreciate those efforts of everybody who was involved in development of this document, the Ministry for Reintegration of the occupied territories, everybody who moves this way. The effective strategy on the internally displaced persons until year 2024 was developed jointly in cooperation with the ministry, civil organizations, international community, and was subject to basic international standards on human rights, but it does not correspond to the current challenges which resulted from the most numerous movement of people in Europe. And it says about the humanitarian consequences, and the strategy approved back in June 2022, a quarter of the country is the number of people which was internally displaced in Ukraine, is the biggest scale internal displacement since World War II. And this document gradually and consistently complies with all the response to all the challenges, starting from the moment the person leaves their residence until the moment of reintegration. And in the recommendations by the Council of Europe 26.6, it's stated directly that the state which faces such challenges should not be left alone, and it's the joint responsibility of international community to ensure, and I will quote it, consistent, long-term, coordinated and non-discriminational support on part of the member states of the Council of Europe in response to the internal displacement. And two more things I want to stop at concisely. The inclusive approach that was used in preparation of this document, it's the incredibly positive result of cooperation, because the development of the document started with the Ministry of Reintegration gathering key partners, civil sector, international partners, and offering 5 key strategic goals. They got the first feedback, the vision from the fields, from the zones mostly affected, the regions mostly who receive most of the internally displaced person. And the work on the document started by articulating the priority steps which were formed in a proper way, turning into indicators, measurable figures. And my key statement is that any document should provide hope, but at the same time be realistic and performable and oriented as the achievable goals. And the document itself defines the available goals and the ways to react to them. And the draft document has a list of indicators which allow measuring the result, and it has the gradual plan, phase by phase plan. And the task of the ministry that we agreed to the maximum extent is not only to create a good document, but to ensure its proper implementation with all means available. So it's our honor to be here, to be in Kyiv, to be together with our reliable partners, and to be most useful. Ms. Iryna, one of the characteristics of the democratic society is when such documents are, when the civil sector is getting involved in the development of such documents. So a couple of words about your participation in the development of this the draft, and then we can proceed to the presentation of the strategic goals. Good evening, dear colleagues. I want to start my speech with the words of gratitude, because readiness of the ministry to communicate with discuss it with the civil organizations to find constructive results. We have to say that we worked on the previous strategy together, and we worked on this strategy together too, and it's a very good progress because it's based on the experience of the civil organizations and the ministry, because the ministry works a lot with the problems of the internally displaced persons, and they know very well, they're aware with the problems of the people in regions, and so it was a constructive work, and I want to appreciate the work of Ms. Vice Prime Minister and the Office of Council of Europe for the support of this work, because it was based on the discussions with the colleagues to achieve the real result, to create the document which will be goals of which would be achievable. It's a great practice which would be good to implement by other ministries in development of such strategic documents. First, well, before we proceed to the presentation of the strategic goals, I want to once again mention that from the beginning of the last year, we had the explosive growth of the internally displaced persons, and this was one of the first reasons why we need to start talking about the new strategy, because we invested efforts in development of state policy for integration of internally displaced persons, and we oriented on the fact that the people who were moved, they were in the communities for a long time, they require support in becoming a proper part of the community, in implementation there or exercising their political rights on the local level, to be integrated into the life of the community. But since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, we've witnessed a lot of people who became internally displaced persons for the second time, or they were displaced for the first time, and the government has to state something about the new instrument of adaptation to help people adapt in the new communities before they reintegrate, or in case they decide to go back and reintegrate to their native communities. So we decided that we have to discuss all the steps, all the challenges faced by the internally displaced persons, and the development of the strategy became the response for this. And the new strategy until year 2025, which has to replace the strategy for reintegration of the internally displaced persons, and it does not only include the element of integration, but also a number of other steps, just like Ms. Iryna said, since the decision to become the internally displaced person until the moment of they make a decision for reintegration as they get back to their residence, when they need support for reintegration from the state. So the structure of this document, the strategy for internally displaced individuals, it has 5 key goals which are related to evacuation. Or the basic element is the increase of capacity of the state in reaction to the challenges of internal displacement, and ensuring the conditions for implementation of state policy in the sphere of internal displacement, and ensuring of safe evacuation of citizens from dangerous regions, and the assistance in adaptation to internally displaced in their new residence, and assistance to the integration of the internally displaced persons in their new residences. So all those goals are disclosed in the document. It's a very good practice. When we first adopted the document, and then we were developing the plan. Here we don't only see the strategic goals, but we see the plan to achieve those strategic goals. It increases the size of the document for those who will want to submit proposals to improvement of the document, but it also describes the way we achieve the goals. And I would like to start with the first strategic goals is the increase of the state capacity in reaction to the challenges of internal displacement. So here we have to review the legislation related to the internal displacement, and we have to redefine the notions of the internal displacement and reintegration. We used to make amendments to it, but the challenges, they still remain, and the volume of the challenges grows. So we have to adopt a new legislation on ensuring the exercising of rights of internally displaced persons, and have all the information about such displaced persons reintegrated to other databases. After the beginning of the full state aggression, we faced the fact that we don't have proper statistics on the internally displaced persons because many people did not get registered. They did not believe that their displacement is for a long time, and probably not all the persons who were displaced, they got registered as the internally displaced persons. And in the same way as those who returned to their native residences, they reported to the state that they came back. So in the same way, the third part of this strategic goal is the implementation of monitoring of the needs of internally displaced citizens, because basically the state has to orient on the evaluation of such needs and to build their strategy based on their request, based on the demands of the internally displaced person, on their needs. So they have to search for partners, the organizations who may satisfy such needs. And I would like to pass the microphone to Ms. Maria. Good evening, everybody. Well, I'm presenting strategic goal number 2, so ensuring of self-evacuation of the citizens from dangerous regions and satisfaction of their humanitarian needs. We emphasized it a couple of times that it's important in the text of the strategy to show the logic sequence of the reaction of the state to the internal displacement of the citizens. So such internal displacement starts with evacuation, in fact. So the strategic goal number 2 is like that, and it includes a number of key tasks. Specifically, we're talking about coordination of the process of safe evacuation, and in communication with the organizations who work in this field and using their experience, we emphasized it many times, the fact of safety and security of evacuation, and we paid a lot of attention to certain category of people, like disabled people, for example, and people with limited mobility, because I think those accents, the importance of these accents goes without saying. Also, we emphasize the task of ensuring proper communication about all the phases of evacuation and all the means of further support. Based on our experience, we understand how important it is, and the decision on the evacuation itself is a very complicated process. And we've seen it many times, how the people remain in the areas of active warfare, and the reasons for that is that people just don't know where they would be going to, what they are about to do, and how the state would help them. Meanwhile, there is a lot of information provided. It's still never too much, and this fact is reflected in the strategy. It should be systemic and it should be consistent. So this goal is stated in very specific plan. So the humanitarian aid to the evacuated evacuated aid to internally displaced citizens is very logic step. So those who make decision to become an internally displaced in the operational way, we have a detailed opinion of how it should be coordinated with the international organization, with the state organizations, with the national organizations, and also in this strategic goal we say about the implementation of systemic support of the communities which accept the internally displaced citizens. So this task is reflected in all the goals, because within the strategy we have to pay attention to the communities who accept the internally displaced citizens too. We don't have to avoid any challenges that they're facing, because meanwhile in February, March previous year, all the communities reacted very proactively. They were able to accept such a huge number of people, provide support to them, but the problems on their level were not actually solved, and the goal I've just voiced within the framework of strategic goal number 2 is reflected in other strategic goals too, and in our opinion it's a key part. So the strategic goal number 2, I will pass the microphone for the presentation of strategic goal number 3. Really, every strategic, in the center of every strategic goal, there is a human. It's a human-centric approach. No document means anything if it doesn't influence the life of people in a good way. To have really good influence on the life of a person, you have to support them on the very beginning of any crisis situation, and the availability of such strategic goal as assistance to the adaptation to the internally displaced persons in their new residences. We appreciate the work of the ministry that we found their support in development of this goal, because we paid previously more attention to integration, because back then the most of the internally displaced were displaced more than half a year, and based on the international experience we know that the half a year is the period when the social and economic adaptations fundamentals are laid. Within this year, it depends whether a citizen may be integrated properly into the society to get a job or remain in a position of a person who needs some support all the time. But just like we have to put a human in the center of any system, in the same way we have to find a level to solve the persons of such individuals and to vest the authorities to make the decisions on the basic level into such individuals. So our task is the assistance to the internally displaced in satisfaction of their needs. Everything that can be solved on the level of the community should be solved on the level of the community, and it should not be brought up all the way up the chain of command. We have to withdraw from the practice of Soviet Union when all the decisions were taken on top level. And when people submit some request to the ministry, they don't really believe their problems could be solved. It's not a good practice. To have the conditions created on the level of the society, there should be a mechanism implemented to make sure the communities are supported. So we had cases with the communities where local population amounted to 8,000 people before the war, and there might be 15,000 more internally displaced added. So we have to ensure social adaptation of internally displaced individuals in their new residence, and we're talking here about a number of social services that would allow to efficiently assist proper social economic adaptation by the individual, to get proper education, to integrate into the life of the community, their new community. So we have to provide proper communication on the available services, about the opportunities on the level of the community for internally displaced persons, so they make conscious decisions. Because unfortunately we have a situation when sometimes people have to move 3, 5, or more times before they find a community where they find opportunities for proper adaptation and integration. And due to a huge number of the persons who were moved inside the country, the state had to resort to the practice which gives results but is not efficient, the places of compact residence. We all understand that people don't have to live for years in the places of compact residence, but we cannot find the dispersed residences for the millions of people who were internally displaced in a moment. So we created a number of places of compact residence, like module towns, dormitories, and so on and so forth. The people who are billeted there, they should understand that they would not live there for the next 5 to 10 years. So gradual dispersion of the internally displaced person is one of the key strategic goals. And there is a demand on part of the communities to create the vision and proposal and a task for the government to make a legal framework to make it happen, so that this standard works. And the next step is creation of the conditions for proper psychological support and rehabilitation of the children, because the damage cannot be compensated by the existing system. There is support needed on part of the schools and other educational institutions. The rehabilitation field should be reinforced in view of the fact that there is a lot of damage inflicted already and the crisis is still going on. And in the same way, there are still matters of medical services access, educational services access, and those are the matters that travel from one strategy to another, because regardless of all the efforts of the government, the requirement, the demand is still way more than the state budget can cover. So every strategy sets some achievable goals and tries to go all the way to the solution. All those goals have a number of tasks in operational terms, and upon the submission of these tasks to the executive bodies, maybe the number of these tasks will grow, but it's innovation, and we appreciate the work of the ministry in support of this strategic goal in creating these adaptation conditions. And I pass the microphone back for this disclosing of the strategic goal number 4 is the assistance to integration of internally displaced persons in the accepting territorial communities. So we said that this strategic goal for us in this text of this draft, and we hope that it will soon become an effective strategy. It will be a consistent and subsequent step after the adaptation, and it results from such adaptation. And integration is the logical continuation when the basic needs of the people, such like job or accepting to the kindergarten, the social payment solutions and other aids are being provided, and an individual and the state may start thinking about returning such individual to life and including them into the life of the community, and some strategic thoughts about what they would do in their new residence. So we included a number of tasks for implementation of this goal. So there is a goal for implementation of system of monitoring of reintegration, which was not implemented before. However, it is still a very important element for tracking the way how integrated those individuals are and how do we achieve our goals in integrating of those people. And for me personally, it's the task that results from the evaluation of the needs which should be performed on the previous phase. It may sound boring, but for the state bodies and international organizations, it's very important element for tracking, for monitoring of the exercising the policy. It has its proper indicators, and integration has the practical reflection, which is in social integration of children. Here we touch the problems of the children and people affected by the aggression. We couldn't ignore this matter, and it's yet a subject for another discussion, but now it sounds like an issue reflected in the draft strategy. Further on, there is a task for reinforcement of measures on professional training or retraining and support of employment, which is the support of the basic needs of the people. It shouldn't be minimized. And during the informal discussions with the ministry, we already had a lot of ideas how it should be done in the most efficient manner. And on the level of operation plan, we will see many interesting proposals. But just like we said before, the wording of the draft may be corrected, and this is why we gathered today. And under this reintegration goal, we also have a number of tasks in the sphere of billeting, provision with the dwelling, because we understand that it's one of the biggest blocks and it should account the requirements and the capabilities of the people. So we have to create the residence funds for the internally displaced, the expansion of lending programs, for example, and anything that could be useful for any specific individual, and it would be discussed in complex by the government. Also, among the tasks of this goal is not less important block for the youth and support of social unity and national unity. So it sounds like a formal thing, but it's the phase of inclusion of the youth in the life of the society, in the life of the community, the participation in local democracy in different forms. Among those tasks, we have the involvement of internally displaced persons in consultancy, for example, of local communities, or in making decisions on the level of those communities they've moved to, when those internally displaced individuals may take part in the political life of the communities where they see any perspective. Olga? Well, and the last fifth strategic goal is the support of the safe and secure return to the left place of residence and reintegration there. So other strategies included that block too, but it was formal because we didn't have such experience of this big scale internal displacement, and we didn't know that people would be coming back. We have a forecast for mass deoccupation of our territories, so we have to think how this voluntary return of the left residents be ensured. And we have to start with the fact that we need to create this policy on their reintegration, because it will be related not only to internally displaced individuals, but also to for those who return from abroad to the safer regions, and then they would want to go back to the liberated areas. And there it should be a consistent policy coordinated with this government for the return of the internally displaced persons, or assistance to such places. The compensation for the destroyed property or damaged property, it's a very difficult task, and we talk about it a lot, but the matter of return will be directly related to the issue of compensation, and this policy should be in place. We know about the existing initiatives, and I hope they will be adopted on the level of legislation, or at least so that our international partners who would be ready to talk about some financial compensation, reimbursement for damage, they should know about the approach implemented in the state. in this regard. And we have to say that people who return should get adequate information about where they return. It means not only mind safety, but it's very important. I mean, physical safety is important, but it's also about the functioning of the social infrastructure, educational institutions, kindergartens, so that people who make decision to return, they should know what should they expect in terms of infrastructure, life in that territory. Also, we're saying that it's principle to have the policy of state policy as to the employment in the territories where we forecast mass return, and also the implementation of the legal status of territories of priority development. We're talking about the territories with significant damage, because we have already experience of other countries. We know how the state may stimulate the citizens to return to the left territories through tax subsidies and other stimuli that should be laid as fundamental to the new legislation. We think about priority development territories. They may be called otherwise, but the sense should be that the government could raise funds and get engaged the people in the territories which were occupied to stimulate this return, voluntary and secure return. And I hope that the government will work in this area efficiently further on. Thank you. Thank you for this presentation, Ms. Iryna. The goals are quite ambitious. I would like to ask you to finalize to summarize everything that was said, and to say a couple of words what's on after the implementation of this strategy. Well, you've heard what a tremendous job was done. I'm looking from the other perspective. Well, and there's a lot of work ahead. I imagine the local programs, the state level programs, something should be done in the regional level. For example, in 2022, those communities which were active did not adopt the programs for internally displaced right away. Now many regions adopted new programs, and decentralization did its job. The active communities want the people who came to be left, they want them to be new active members. They want to have those businesses relocated to their regions. I'm seeing the regions with my team, and once in 2 weeks I'm seeing the new approaches which are quite adaptable in other regions. I'm seeing Chernivtsi, Zakarpattia region, Lviv region, Chernivtsi region. Everybody does it in their own way, but they all strive to make the people's lives most comfortable possible. And they don't want the people to become professional internally displaced person. People need to want to integrate. It takes time, and psychological support is important in this regard. People just make their way from under fire, and they need time to adapt. They cannot start thinking about finding a new job in just a week. People need psychological support. They need some mental recreation. If they have, for example, small children, well, obviously it takes time. So the government, together with international partners, really, we did it back in 2022 in manual mode. We were walking through the minefield, so to say, and I appreciate the work of the international partners. They did a lot to have this project for the plan for implementation of a humanitarian reaction for the relocation, the places of compact residence. We have about 6,500 of them, and almost a million people resides in such places, and we have to find possibilities for such persons to go somewhere, to find places where they can live or return to the liberated areas so they find themselves. But it means jobs, it means billeting, it means dwelling or compensation for their lost property. And you emphasized it properly, the people who want to come back from abroad. It's yet another program by the government, but it should correlate and it should be coherent with our strategy, so that people make this decision to return to our homeland and to live here, to develop here, to have their children attend school here. So to summarize it all, we are ready for the questions. It's first thing, and further on there will be discussion on our website. We have this draft in our website until 24th of February. We accept proposals before this date. Please submit your proposals in any form that is convenient to you. Provide your proposals and we will discuss them. After the 24th, we will develop the draft resolution for the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, and according to our forecast, in the first days of March, it should be adopted as the consistent strategy. Dear colleagues, I understand that probably you need time to think about what you've heard, but I'm sure you're having questions right now, so please avail yourself of this opportunity. Good evening, Angelina Strashko, Ukrinform. Ms. Iryna, my question is to you. What's your assessment of the employment of the internally displaced persons in the communities they move to? Maybe there is some statistics about that. And on the background on this news of the intensity of the battles in the east, is there increased number of those who wish to move from the east? Well, the scheduled evacuation is still in place. We keep evacuating people from Donetsk. There is mandatory evacuation. We keep evacuating people from Kherson and Kharkiv regions. So I call the people to evacuate from Donetsk region, Bakhmut, Vuhledar, Soledar, and other settlements. There are heavy, very intense battles there. The intensity of shellings is incredible, and it's no place for civil population, specifically children. I want to remind once again, Bakhmut, we keep reading the reports on a daily basis. We hear about the heroic efforts of the volunteers, national police. They get under shellings just to save the children. Please, I call all the parents to be responsible. Please don't try the state, don't try the states for their resilience. Yes, we are democratic. We do understand that children who have parents who are in families, they are under the care of their parents, and the law guarantees all such rights. But I have to remind you about your responsibilities and duties, and it's in the best interest of the kids to have them evacuated from the battlefield. They shouldn't be there in no case. There is no single reason to have them retained there. And after the occupation, when we push enemy away, and I'm sure we will do it way sooner than they expect, and then we will rebuild it and we will see the smiles on the faces of our children. Everything will work. But so back to evacuation, it's still underway, but we don't forecast any big waves of movement because we see that today is 16th of February, so we withstood all those waves of evacuation. The enemy was targeting our infrastructure, civil objects. They were trying to destroy the critical infrastructure facilities, but we made it. We were able to move thousands of people. Since winter, we were able to locate them, to build them, so we don't expect any big waves, but people will continue going because you see there is incessant shelling of Kherson, for example, a targeting of civil infrastructure. We keep reading about the people being killed every day. Kharkiv region, Kupiansk, Vovchansk, it's all under shelling now. And back to the first question about the employment. The percentage is really not so big. I cannot say that about more than 50% of the people were employed, but it depends on geography. For example, it depends on the region people came to. Obviously, there are more employments in the western regions. Obviously, many businesses relocated there, and the same cannot be said about the eastern region. Proximity to the border with the European Union, it has conditions for trans-border cooperation. For example, in Poland, there are 25 joint Ukrainian-Polish enterprises, businesses in Poland, and it's the people who were internally displaced. They work there. They want to have businesses in Ukraine, so it works. So it would be irrelevant to say that there is some percentage. For example, there are more jobs in the Western regions. People used to think probably that there are more opportunities in Kyiv, but as in terms of payment, well, obviously the number of people living here is unprecedentedly big compared to the number of people living in other regions, but the number of problems is way bigger here too. So we work together. Thanks God we have good cooperation with our international partners and the local governments. So I hope that the accent would be on employment, how to help with the micro grants, mini grants, how to support the relocated businesses. The government has their projects, but we will need in 2022 to make emphasis on the jobs. As long as people have jobs, they will feel free and comfortable.
Mr. Iryna, I want to ask two questions. First is a part of this should be how to reconstruct the places most bombed, like here north of Kyiv, northern Saltivka, or like villages near Izium. Thing is, there is some plan for this reconstruction, how this is working, who providing this reconstruction, and for example, how much money does it cost? Second question, there are some special cases. I know people from places like Bakhmut, even people living in Zabakhmutka area, people left to central Ukraine, and after when they came, they returned back, or now happening like people paying for taxi drivers after evacuation to get them back to Bakhmut, because they see they don't have vision of living, and those people really living in those special affected areas. Is there a plan somehow focus especially on those people? Thank you.
Дякую. Щодо відновлення, дійсно у нас є план. Кабінет міністрів на чолі з віце-прем'єром Кубраковим.
Yes, we do have plan for such people. Together with the Minister Kubrakov, there was a meeting headed by Denis Shmyhal, the Prime Minister of Ukraine, where the relevant ministry presented the plan which would include a number of such efforts by the government: fast recovery, capital renewal, capital reconstruction. We are being helped by the European banks, the World Bank. There are first 50 million euro which will be allocated now to help our people in current repairs, I mean to reinstall the windows, to cover the roofs. So yes, there is a plan for it, and it's presented in the website on the Ministry of Infrastructure. They have the register of damaged and destroyed properties. Everything is digitalized now. It should be first written and then funded. And for what I've heard from the report by the ministry, we have in our account 17 billion hryvnias, which will be already allocated for reconstruction of the destroyed property. But it's the beginning, but we start accumulating funds. They're not enough yet, but they are good enough to demonstrate the way the government will act with regard to the people that were affected. And I know, I'm convinced the plan will work if we all together will keep the hand on the pulse, so to say. People want to hear directly what they should do, all the basic documents for documenting the damaged and destroyed property through DIA, through the local governments. And now in 2022 there will be new residential areas which will be repaired. And as to Bakhmut and the territories where people first leave and then they come back. Yes, you are right about Bakhmut. So 70,000 people used to live there before the full-scale invasion. Now it's less than 6,000 living there. About 110 of them are children. Well, now it's less. Yeah, they keep evacuating the children. It's about 110 children. So out of 70,000, 252 persons returned. And in response to my questions, why do they come back? Really, someone has different conditions. Relatives die, for example. People have the right to come. That there are restrictions for living and coming back. We understand that it's a huge risk. We communicate all the threats to those people, but to say that people come back in mass, I cannot say so. That was in the beginning, in March, in April, even until the midsummer. There were cases when people really did not get any aid from the government or from the communities, and they had to come back, including to the Donetsk region or even to the territories which were under control of the occupier. But there are less and less cases like this. There is more and more communication, more and more information, and more opportunities for them. So that problem you asked about, it's not as actual as it used to be half a year ago. We have more questions on the floor, please. Good evening, Margarita Trofimova, Luganshina Broadcasting Company, IRTA. My question is about the strategy for Lugansk region. Our region was always divided in two. We used to have the occupied territories since 2014 and the newly occupied territories. What should the residents of the Lugansk region count on? Do you have any specific plans as to the region? Well, first of all, just like everybody, we have to wait for the occupation. Unfortunately, now it's very little number of the occupied settlements, and fortunately there is very little number of people still living there. Today's report by the military governor of the region, he reported how the military administration works. We can only coordinate if there is not enough authorities in the local level as to the restrictions that we have to lift now. So according to the report of Mr. Gaidai, every regional center or every region has a humanitarian center for support of the residents of Lugansk region. And correct me if I'm wrong, this is what I've heard, and I know that those centers exist. I'm not sure about every region, but I know that they exist, and people gather humanitarian aid there, different hygienic means. It has Starlinks, and they are equipped like resilience stations for longer use, not like in Kyiv, for example. And as to the separate program for Lugansk region, no, it does not exist. It will be on the same level with the Donetsk region. When we talk about the territories of priority development, we had an idea back in 2021, and it was almost implemented as a legislation. We proposed to vote for the law which would separate the regions of Donetsk and Lugansk with ensuring military risks. And now we are rethinking one of the goals is creation of legislation which would help the deoccupied territories. They will be fully deoccupied, to return them, reintegrate them, and provide them with the opportunities they never had and they don't have until now. Did I answer your questions? More questions?
Afternoon, Italian Public Radio. We have spoken about displaced children. I would move a little bit more on deported children. So which are the data that you can give to us at the date? And what do you know about these children, about their condition? Which are the plans of the government to have them back? And also, which is your perspective about having them back? Thank you.
Те, що Росія депортовує
The fact that Russia deports our children is the genocide. And Russia will be brought liable. They will be punished for their actions. the fact that our children, specifically the orphans, were deported without our consent, and even with our protests, written protests, I submitted the letter to Ministry of Defense of Russia and Ms. Moskalkova that we do not allow deporting our children. We demand to open humanitarian corridors and to either let us get in there or give us back the children from fostering homes. And Russia did not agree, and instead they forcibly deported our children, and they continue doing this. They keep deporting them from occupied territories. Moreover, they resort to more cynical and more aggressive forms of forcible change of identity, talking about the centers of re-educations or camp for re-education, and they don't even hide it, which is again the genocide against our people, including children. So they state that children will be changed their identity. They will be educated in the alien culture, in the alien language environment. And as to the illegal adoption, there are many reports that our children were illegally adopted by Russian families. There are decrees by President Putin. And again, I want to have this moment documented. It's not only Putin who will be liable for this, but everybody who was taking part, starting from the driver who was transporting those children to all those families who assist in this big scale and cynical crime against our children. I already explained it. If the adults may find opportunity to call, to let somebody know, give their details about their location, to live for the third countries, the children, they don't have such protection, they don't have such rights, specifically such children as orphans. So it's a very special crime, and I call Italy and all other countries of the free world who understand what Russia is doing, don't stay silent. Call the international community to bring Russia liable for the crimes against our children. For what I have just said about, and about what we're returning, yes, we are returning the children. We have 128 children that we returned. It's very little number, but it's a very difficult process. Who do it, they know how difficult it is. No UNICEF, no UN Security Council can help us. No ICRC, they cannot help us return our children. They cannot even require, they cannot even demand to return our children. They cannot even attain the register. And it's very difficult issue, because in the century 21 we have to continue saying that we cannot protect our children, and the international community just doesn't know what to do. This is why we call the international community to press on Russia and to demand them to return our children. We are ready to organize the corridors. We are ready to go there and bring our children back, because every child has a foster. They are fostered by the state of Ukraine. We don't let them be adopted, and we will do it in all ways possible. And the international tribunal that is about to be created will have a separate area of work on bringing to liability of those who commit crimes like this against our children. Ms. Iryna, you wanted to add something. If I may, Ms. Iryna already mentioned about the orphan kids. I want to say about the children who became orphans during the armed conflict. The state doesn't even know that they are orphaned, that they don't have anybody who fosters them. We know that there is category of such kids. They are such as in Mariupol, and such, for example, case as Lvova Maria Belova, who adopted a child from Mariupol. The commissioner of the government of Russia. So we call all the relatives who know that their niece or nephew were remaining in Mariupol or other places, and they don't know about their parents, what was going on with their parents. Report to the government about such kids, because the government just cannot find it out by themselves. And another aspect that we find out about liberation, so it's so-called camping. When children are being taken to the camps, they get some patriotic education, they're being told about Russia, all those myths about World War II and so on. And after the occupation of Kharkiv and Kherson region, we know that part of the children which were camped in Russian Federation, they are still remain there. And it's very difficult for the parents to bring them back. So it's important to say that if there are any relatives in the occupied territories, and if they are proposed to get the children in camps for short term in Russian Federation or in Crimea, it's better not to do this, because it creates a lot of complications in bringing such children back, in fact liberating them from imprisonment. We have still questions left. Good evening, Valentin Bannych, Visti UA. I'm having a question to Ms. Iryna. There is a project 7421 about the social insurance of the social insurance of internally displaced persons, which contemplates the increase of aid for the payment to the internally displaced people. And if such costs are budgeted, such expenses are budgeted, and there are also proposals on the tax subsidies starting from the summer 2023, that does it also relate to the internally displaced persons and their businesses? And do you have information on the number of businesses which were moved from occupied territories? Well, you prepared very well for this interview. You had to actually send your questions beforehand. Well, obviously we are only pro to increase the payments to the internally displaced individuals, because now it's 2,000, 3,000 hryvnias. Those are the small amounts, and if they only survive on that, it's difficult to survive, for example, for a family with 2 kids, when they need to rent a property, and in case they have no jobs, it's almost impossible. And if there is such an initiative that would allow us increasing the income of the family of internally displaced individuals, it's a sorrow. There's nothing good when people lose everything and they have to move. Sometimes they don't only move their homes, but also their families. So let's don't expand it. But as to the cancellation of these tax subsidies, me as a state government official, I understand that we have to fill our budget. Now we depend a lot on the donors, on international organizations, on our partners and external factors in general. So liquidity of our budget, well, obviously that will not be forever. We have to survive in the conditions that we live in. Our economy fell, and there are objective reasons for that, objective causes, and we have to realize it. On the other side, we keep funding for as much as possible the sector of security and defense. That's obvious. No one will finance our army, and that's correct. The partners say so, that the army should be funded by ourselves, and those are tremendous expenses, and this will continue just as long as the war is on. I hope that the security will remain an important issue further on. We have our rocket program. Well, I'm digressing. Actually, we will have to spend a lot on that. So we have to find the sources. Obviously, everybody feels difficult now. Everybody who pays taxes, it's a great burden for everybody. And just like our president says, we have to tighten our belts, including the government sector. Just like us, the officials, we limit the payment of bonuses and the payments in this government-controlled enterprises. It cannot be like this, that someone pays more and someone doesn't have any liability. It's our joint liability. So if there is such draft law adopted, I wouldn't like it to touch our internally displaced individuals because they feel it difficult anyway. So we will submit some amendments, I guess, and to do everything we can to support our internally displaced persons, because they are a vulnerable category. Because those that I communicated with, I have never seen any rich people there. I usually visit the places of compact residents, the places where the people with limited mobility live. The people survive there. They don't have some lush lives there. So I want to make sure they receive all the necessary aid and they expand the range of instruments that can be engaged in these programs. Do we have a number of the relocated businesses? It's about 400 all across Ukraine. More than 400 medium and big businesses. More than 400 already moved, so we did not document any small businesses. So again, what Prime Minister set us as a task. So we discussed a number of questions there. We're facing the problem now. The people who moved, for example, from Kharkiv or Kharkiv region, the occupied parts of Kharkiv region, say they moved to Ternopil region. They don't want to have their legal address re-registered because they hope that they would return, and I think it's correct, it's right. So they don't want to take all the possibilities, all the opportunities from their region, which is already hemorrhaging. And just like business signals us, if they are relocated but their legal entity remains there, they are being landed on a little scale, including our banks. It's a problem. I have to say it publicly. Even 579, for example, in Kharkiv region, they cannot get those loans. They need access to the cheap money. They need those loans. They need to be helped. They, as we are told by the banks, they are included into the Order 75 about the territories of active warfare. Those territories have their advantages, well, if we can call them advantages, but we have to solve all the issues so that business doesn't suffer, because if we don't do it, the businesses leave, and we have to return the trust to such programs, because we know that international corporations, they don't want to continue cooperations because they deem those territories as risky. And I want to call our international partners, if it's necessary for us to extend any document which confirms that those territories are deoccupied, well, and it does not make the business activities cease, they need to be provided loans, they need to be invested in, they need to get access to the cheap money. And if we work on the amendments to the legislation that would allow the work on such business, if there are anybody who hears me, please apply to the ministry, and we will write the guarantee letters for them for you to unblock your activities abroad, so that people are not afraid and they remain in touch. Those are our territories. We have to support them. We have to support them in their survival, and then to help you get reconstructed. We've got all the questions from the floor, and I want to remind you that until February 24th, the draft strategy will be on the website, and you may avail yourself of opportunities to submit any additional amendments, proposals. And I want to thank all of our speakers for this broadcast. we had Iryna Vereshchuk, Hanna Christova, Alyona Lunyova, Maria Krasnenko, та Valeria Vershynina. Thank you for this conversation, and we continue working on our victory, trust in our armed forces, and glory to Ukraine.